The Right on Point podcast is a candid discussion of your legal rights, civil liberty ramifications, legalities of possible mandates of COVID vaccines, and actions by our federal government and state governments. Plus exploring the untouchable topics within the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, the PrEP Act, and the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program. Welcome to the Right on Point podcast with Wayne Rohde.
Thank you for being here today on the Right on Point podcast. It's my pleasure to talk with you. I'm your host, Wayne Rohde. Today's program is a little bit different. You know, in the past, we've been talking a lot about corruption of our federal governments and things like this, but I want to get back to one of the things that got me going in advocacy for my son, Nick, and it has to do with how families deal with a disabled child of some sort. And we have just an explosion of chronic illness here in the United States. It's unbelievable. And it's also happening around the world. But lost in that conversation sometimes is what happens to the siblings of the disabled child or special needs child, but also the pressures on the family and what happens from there. So a lot of you might know the story of my son, Nick, and his twin brother, Austin. Nick is now, they're 26. He was vaccine injured at the age of 13 months and then regressed in what we call severe regressive autism. But his brother stepped up, even when they were a young age. Austin decided that he was going to help Nick all the way around, all the way up through today. He is his legal guardian. He also is his protector. He has sacrificed so much for the sake of his brother. So this really means a lot to me for this discussion. Joining us today is Linda Scotson, who wrote this book, a wonderful book from Skyhorse Publishing called The Other Child. But it was brought to my attention from a good friend of ours from the program here at Ken McCarthy and his team, Paul Morrison. Now, Ken, you approached me about a month and a half ago and sent me this book, and it's just amazing. What were you wanting to make sure we discussed today?
One, to draw attention to the issue of the other family members, especially the children. There is no book like this. This is it. And yet, for every family that's facing this, there's probably a child or two or three. And Linda has such a beautiful, elegant approach to this situation based on her own experience of having a son born with cerebral palsy. And we should point out that we're talking about any kind of severe disability where that child by necessity calls for a lot more time, attention, and energy than is the norm. And so since there's not infinite time, seemingly it has to come from the rest of the family, right? So this could apply to any problem. The other thing I want to point out after we talk about the dynamics of the family, which I think is really important, and that's what the book is about. I'll hold it up in case you don't have here we go.
Right.
Is that in addition to her own experience working with her son and her family, Linda has worked with hundreds, probably well north of 1,000 families in similar difficulty clinically. And she has a very remarkable track record. For instance, cerebral palsy is not supposed to be improvable or reversible, and she's done it routinely. And what she does is based on practical experience, but also deeply rooted in science. And she's been at it for 40 plus years. So I want people, one, to know about this important book and this important resource, but I also want them to know about her clinical work and her research, which I think is really, I know is very significant.
Well, thank you, Ken. I appreciate that. Now, Linda, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
we had to talk about you because we have to let people know who you are. But the book from Skyhorse, which I'm also an author, published by Skyhorse. So thank you very much for doing that. And it's also got tagged by the Children's Health Defense and part of their book library, which is a huge marketing plus. So welcome to the show. Thank you very much for being here. Tell us a little bit about yourself personally before we get into your practice.
I think talking about myself, and particularly my childhood, is very relevant because I was a very adventurous and observant child. And the idea of being free, of being, we lived on the edge of the country. So I was out in the woods, I was climbing trees, I was making dens. There was a canal nearby, which you could do dangerous things like improvise boats on. In the winter, I lived in the north of England, and it was really cold for 3 months, and there was ice on the dams that were near to us, and we used to skate on the dams and avoid falling through the ice, but always questioning, and my parents were always they obviously loved one another very much, but they argued about things, and I was intrigued because after a bit I was let into the argument. So then it went 3 ways, whatever we were discussing. And my father would read opposing views of things before he made up his mind about anything. So this level of questioning, which I seem to have naturally, and for which I was sent into the corridor in school on countless occasions for arguing with my teachers, whereas I didn't think that I was arguing. I thought I was just inquiring, putting forward a good point, because something didn't quite seem to fit for me. But I also seem to have a talent for painting, for art, and I read widely, even as quite a young child. So this ability to observe was carried on through in my later life when I began to sell my paintings and teach at art colleges. And really, I suppose I was seeing art as embodied philosophy, that I was always using it as a jumping off point so that my students would have a much wider range. And I particularly like to teach life drawing. I like to look at the human body and how it aligned itself and how it fell into a configuration of postural balance. And I wasn't that wonderful at maths, but I liked the idea of it, and I liked reading books on physics, and I liked the reading a bit of this and then seeing if I could somehow rephrase it to talk to my students about how all this, how one small movement would alter the whole configuration. And that since the model was always breathing, he or she was never still. So this was my background. And then I was living in London, and I fell in love, and my partner and I moved to the countryside because there was something happening. The 60s was kind of breaking down. The era of optimism was beginning to shift away, and London didn't feel like this warm, free place that it had done previously. So further and further we went adventurously till we found Ashdown Forest. And this was near where Winnie the Pooh, if any of your listeners, viewers would the enchanted place, Pooh Corner, all of these places were on the forest, but nobody knew about them. So at that time, it was a kind of hidden mystery. I was very surprised to find it. There were streams by our house and little pools, and in the hot summers we seemed to have them. You could swim in them, but I could get up to London easily on the train. And then I conceived my daughter, Lily, and I was just amazed by her. I was amazed by every part of the pregnancy, my sense of her presence inside me, sensations that I was aware of long before I felt her body actually shift in me. and I, so I talked to her and talked to her a lot of the time. People must have thought I was crazy, because sometimes when I was driving, I pulled up at the traffic lights and I'd be talking to her, and somebody looking, who is she talking to? Nowadays, you'd think you were talking on a mobile phone, but of course, it wasn't there as an excuse. And and so I was determined that she would be a totally natural childbirth. I didn't want any drugs interfering with her mind and her joy and her ability to facilitate her own birth. So I had a very kind local doctor who put me through to a village. Well, it was a small town that had somewhere between a town and a village, but it did have a maternity unit, and you could do more or less what you liked in it. And so there in the sunshine, and with her father's help, because he had been with me all the way through the birthing classes that I went to, with a thermos flask of coffee with brandy in it, which I'd read a book that the French did this, and to celebrate afterwards. So, so it was the most wonderful moment of my entire life. And we sort of breathed Lily into the world. And then I was taken to the ward, and she was taken back and given to me. And obviously she breastfed immediately, which was the most amazing feeling too, because you feel, oh, I've got this wonderful gift. What can I have everything in my body for my child. It's amazing. So beautiful. And so delightful. And the other mothers were saying, how is it you were so alive and awake, and you're with your baby and you're breastfeeding? Well, I didn't have any drugs. I didn't have any drugs, and nobody pushed me to have any drugs. So then there was looking at the wonder of Lily's development, of her movement, the elegance of her movements and how they built up. And we had a tremendously close relationship, the three of us, because she slept with us. She slept under my arm. The tales since then, at the university, I read a lot of papers that suggested this was the most natural way for babies to be close to their mother, because they also get the benefit of their mother's breath. This was a series of papers. And it was writing to suggest that that the precautions against sudden infant cot death had been overstated, because there were clear markers that would perhaps create some anxiety. But even with that anxiety, the baby should be under observation of its parent on its tummy for some of the time, because this developed the whole respiratory system. And the levels of arterial oxygen are much higher when the baby is on its tummy. But not long after Lily was a few years old, then came this huge pressure to lay babies on their backs all the time. However, I was unaware of that. I was simply just enjoying her development. But her father, who was a very intelligent and creative person, nevertheless had difficulties with depression, and unfortunately he killed himself. And it was both expected and unexpected, because I had thought I had, with everything we had, but then the opposite side would affect him. And I found out, of course, now I know he had a very difficult birth himself. He was a very large baby. And I can see that he was very tall. His breathing tended to be up here. I could see a lot of the reasons that would have led to that destabilization. But he had done so many wonderful things for us, and I felt his presence so close. I was somehow having experienced that pain of loss, which is like an electromagnetic field that's being altered in you. It's very like birth in a way if you come out with a kind of new relationship. Hard to say, but that's what happened to us. So then, but I was pregnant with Doran. So I was 2 months pregnant with Doran. And so to earn my living at that time, I'd also been doing furniture restoration, painting lacquered furniture from antique shops that were sent me the stuff down to our little cottage from London, from the King's Road. And so our house was full of these strange objects. So we could support ourselves. And there was a feeling of hope and love as Doran grew inside me. And very good school friend was coming down to help me at the birth. I was allowed to have a home delivery. Everything seemed really good. I had other friends who'd been looking after us, although living in a little cottage on Ashdown Forest, there was nevertheless a hidden community there, and we shared a lot more. I don't know how communities are in your country, but communities have been broken up a lot in the UK, but in those days there was still a strong sense of community. And so Doran was born, and the birth was lovely. Again, I didn't need anything. I just held him to me, and he was at my breast before they cut the cord, and put him in a warm bath. It seemed very perfect, but I felt there was something wrong. He seemed very different from Lily. Lily seemed so at home. Even though she was the other side of things, she seemed so at home. Whereas Doran's eyes were flashing from side to side, as if he suspected something awful was going to happen. And he was also yellowy. And I was concerned about this. And so I rang and voiced my concerns to my midwife. Oh, no, everything is absolutely fine. It's wonderful now. You've got your family. It's complete, and things are going to be grand. So as the day and the next day wore on, it was getting more and more alarming to me. So the midwife was finally persuaded by me to come, and she said, oh, well, I didn't do the bilirubin heel prick test. I said, why didn't you do it? Oh, we're so happy it might cause the baby a little discomfort. I didn't want to do it. I said, well, I'm just surprised that you didn't, because it isn't really invasive. You're only taking a little drop of blood, only for a moment. Anyway, so she took it. And before the next day was over, Doran was seizuring. And about the time he was seizuring, I got a telephone call. I had to get to the hospital straight away. He had a very, very high level of the bile pigment bilirubin, which had been released as my body's defense against him, because we had different blood groups. And although the blood groups appeared to be the same, there was one antibody test that they didn't do. And they actually didn't do that at that time. So my friend Catherine, who was with us, said, I'll drive you to the hospital. So she got into my car to drive, and I was in the back with Lily and Doran. But where I live, there are many little twisty, windy roads, a bit unlike the part of England that she came from. And she was going too slow. So I said, Catherine, please, get into the back seat. I'll drive. So I just put my foot down in my old car. And she said afterwards, well, Linda, I thought we were all going to pass. I thought we were all going to heaven. If there was a heaven, we were all going there. I didn't want to distress you by telling you this. So the hospital staff were waiting on the doorstep, and we were taken straight in. I had to wait for the blood test to be taken, the level of bilirubin, which was extraordinarily high. They thought it was surprised it hadn't already killed him. And so he went through 2 exchange transfusions and phototherapy. And while he was in the phototherapy, and Lily at that time went to stay with some friends who lived very close by, who had a child her own age. So that was all right. No, I wanted to breastfeed him. Oh, no, 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 you can't do that. It's impossible. So I said, well, look, I tell you what, just give me a chance. I'll donate my milk if you let me breastfeed him. That's a deal. Deal done. So they were very short on milk, and I had it in abundance, which again they couldn't quite understand since I'd obviously been under some stress. But Doran breastfed. I mean, took a little while. I was jiggling him about and talking to him, feeling his body, and doing a lot of instinctive things, which I think do come to our rescue. We are not devoid. We have an immune system, but we also have a lot of instinctive reactions to things. That if we're allowed that response, allowed to acknowledge that response and utilize it, then I think that in itself would be a major contribution to our health. So Dawn breastfed. So now I had a baby who could feed and who I was allowed to go in regularly to feed. So he was in for 10 days, and they told me I could take him home, but I had to go down and discuss his future with the doctors present. And as I went down in the lift, it was as if I was with an angel. I knew that somehow my life was going to change completely. It would never be the same again. I couldn't look at any of the directions that I had anticipated previously. So they said, well, he's very seriously brain injured. The level of bilirubin, I mean, it surprises us that he's actually still alive. We think that you might be better advised to put him into care, because he'll never be able to recognize you. He won't be able to move. He'll have to have phenobarbital for you to dress or undress him. He'll be crying all the time. Presumably he was drugged, and that was why he wasn't crying in the unit. And here's a social worker who will help you. So I said, well, look, I don't know how much you understand, but I am full of love for this child. I'm going to celebrate his birth. I'm not going to let Lily miss out on the rightful celebration. She's got a brother, and I'm now responsible. And I'm now responsible. So for the first time really in my life, I was responsible for another human life that was in such desperate need. And I had to use my own resources, or the resources that had been gifted to me through the gift of life, as best I could. And the first thing I did was to throw away the phenobarbital. And the second thing that I did once I got home, apart from putting some nice music on and warming up the house and being encouraging for Lily, was to hold him to my body, because instinctively I realized that holding him to my body would be putting him back in the most secure place that he could possibly remember. Now, babies have a very strong sense of smell, which they have because they have to root for milk, but also to identify who people are around, because their vision is not so good. So he knew he was still with me. The house presumably was beginning to smell familiar. And as long as I kept him on my body, so I was twisting and turning and moving. I couldn't hold him in any one position. He wanted to be moved all the time. So I know now that that was having an effect on the vestibular apparatus, which was the little hairs in the ears, which help you balance and counterbalance. But this, because everything in the body connects, and human development is a development of connectedness, and connectedness both internally and externally in every possible way. So it was working on his breath as well. And so he was receiving my breath as a regulator, and all of this movement was helping to, in a sense, stretch his diaphragm and create a better shifting of blood supply. If you drug somebody and leave them there, they may not be doing anything that is problematic, but in effect, they're not developing the most important thing, which is developing the infrastructure of blood vessels in your body. Now, there is a lot of literature and very good books on this, and it's totally ignored clinically. Without the development of those blood vessels, with the little sphincter muscles that push the blood around, and the valves which return it to the heart, which is a diaphragmatic function, I might add, then your development is inevitably compromised. And how do blood vessels develop? How do they grow and branch? Well, it's the blood that spins through them. And so when you put light pressure from a breath on a blood vessel, then the blood begins to spin. And I knew that it was called vasomotion, that it spun like so. But now I'm reading it spins like a double helix. But what happens then is that this is a trigger for switching on the genetic material in the cells, which are going to grow the blood vessels. So they grow and branch and they feed the cells. And of course, the same thing happens to the cells. The two things that we know switch on genetic material are the presence of oxygen, which can also be interpreted as the presence of electrons relaying information, because our body is an information system carried by its waters. So these things I didn't know, but I felt difference in Doran's body. I felt the tenseness going out of Doran's body. I felt even a creeping pleasure in Doran's body. Now, I was told he was likely to be profoundly deaf, and his vision was obviously somewhat compromised as his eyeballs rolled together by his nose. So I couldn't quite make out what he could see at the best of times, even given that the baby is short-sighted. But there was a difference in him. And of course, naturally, I wanted to involve him also in changes in pattern during the day. So the day wasn't monotonous. He could anticipate. I wanted him to anticipate other pleasurable activities. So I bathed him every day with lots of things. And the presence of Lily was very important, because she was sharing him. It was, I felt, important for her to feel that she wasn't left out in anything, but also very important for him. And their connectedness was important for me. So on the basis of, if you whistle a happy tune, you begin to be happy, I didn't let any darkness come in. And I didn't want it to be a feigned happiness. I wanted it to be an affirmed, because in this moment, we were together. There was something that, radiated between us, which I suppose, roughly speaking, you could call love. But it was also an excitement that somehow we were creating something. We were creating something together. And so this went on very well until Doran suddenly began to, I missed a bit out, but he had sudden diarrhea, which his nappies were just sort of dry powder. And I became really concerned about this. What on earth was going on here? So I phoned up my doctor, who, as he had shrugged off Doran's condition in the first place, now began to shrug off this. Oh, a little bit of gastroenteritis, he said. Well, I thought, well, gastroenteritis doesn't sound very nice, and it's fatal in Budgerigars. I knew that. So I thought, I'm not going to leave it like this. This is awful. But I'd been told just to do nothing. So I phoned again, and this time I got a locum, and he said, this is very serious. It's hemolytic uremic syndrome, which is kidney failure, in effect. So now I was on another field trip down to the hospital at Brighton. And somebody this time drove the car for us, with a bit wider roads down to Brighton. And from Brighton, we went to Guy's Hospital in London, where Dawn was put immediately on dialysis. And Lily was there all the time. Now, you wouldn't get this in any other hospital now, but the Doran's clinician said, oh, I don't want to separate you. She's got a cold. Tell you what, I'll put her down as pneumonia, and she can occupy a bed in the hospital, and you can just breathe between the two. And those were just such lovely words because somehow this sense of positivity, although he would tell me all the time, well, if I don't get the electrolytes right balance, then, you know, we're going to be in stroke, but I will do my very best for you. But there was one nurse on for 12 hours before she changed shifts. So they were very happy to have me as an auxiliary nurse. So I was on the same shifts with a bed next to it. And I really don't know how she would have managed without me there. So I was there almost all the time, except when I was breathing down to see Lily. And on Christmas Day, or the day before Christmas Day, they took him off everything. So he'd been a month and his kidneys were fine. So then I was under the various Christmas trees and decorations, breastfeeding Doran with Lily, and a registrar came over and said, because I was obviously looking rather happy, you know, I don't want to upset you, but I think perhaps you don't know, your baby's seriously pregnant. And funnily enough, this was funny because I thought Doran was better. I thought for some reason his eyes seemed to have come out. He was better. I knew he was seriously brain injured. His notes hadn't followed him. And I didn't actually say, oh, he's got a serious brain injury. I said he was very stressed around his birth. And then he got this. So without it being an outright lie, I was afraid they might not put him on the dialysis. So now she was telling me this, and of course they thought he was brain injured because of the effect of the dialysis, but I thought he was better. And this sense of him being better, and I wasn't saying how he'd come to be better, but I knew I'd been near him and all the time giving him a sense of continuity. So now we had to get home. There was a blizzard. We were caught in the blizzard. The taxi couldn't go any further, so we had to wait till another car came with trains that would take us home. And then again, Lily and Doran and I, relying on our lovely friends who came over the fields with food because we were snowed in, and nappies, but it gave me time to work with Doran. And a lot of it was also the movement that I had him on my body. And then, so by about I should think about 9 months of after Doran was born, another friend of mine turned up from America, and they also had a small cottage on the forest. And she suggested I take Doran to the Institute for the Achievement of Human Potential, where she said they do work with children with brain injuries with an amazing result. They had no money, but the village raised money, and I was on the television with Doran a lot because this was a most unusual thing to be doing. And anyway, his doctors were quite surprised to find that his condition had not singularly worsened. So then for 5 years, raising money, going to the States, coming back, and doing a 12-hour daily program, in which many people helped Doran, and a basis of it was trying to pattern in normal developmental movements. So the teams that came in 3 times a day didn't really notice Lily. And I noticed that they didn't notice Lily, and I noticed that she was feeling out of it. And I said to them, look, Lily is so amazing. I couldn't have done any of these things really without her. She was a presence for me, a growing presence. And what I'd like you to do is, before you say anything about Dora, ask how you go to Lily. Just ask her how she is. Say a few good, encouraging words. She won't mind after that. She wants to go and play. She just wants to know that you know she's there and she's been involved. So they did do this, and this made a big difference to her. And the other thing that I always did is that when I was putting her to bed, I always thanked her. Always thanked her. I told her I loved her. I thanked her for all the help she'd given during the day. Even if she had been not so perfect during that day, it didn't make any difference, because I knew it was a struggle for her. So whatever she'd done her best that day, relatively speaking. And this was also a great help, because it meant that when she was more able to express herself, she could tell me she didn't have kind of repressed feelings of jealousy and anger with him. She could tell me. She could tell me what she felt. We could go over it. We understood, and also because I'm only human, I would sometimes get angry with her, and in a misplaced way. So I would say, look, I'm human too. We're both human. We often get angry, but we always understand. We forgive one another, and we go on. So don't let it, hold you down. So I mean, in the long term, this has been wonderful, because skipping to now, Lily and I work together, and I couldn't work with in a better situation. She is such a support to me, and I'd often thought it would be a lovely thing to work with one's own daughter, whatever one did. And now, of course, it's running our centre. But then, as time went by, I began to see that the patterning and everything that we had done, which had done wonderful things for Doran, in the sense that he was now walking, which he should obviously never have been, but he wasn't speaking, and his movements were still very uncoordinated. He was fun to be with. He was curious and interesting and entertaining, and we liked it. It was our lives were an adventure, which had all sorts of dips, including economic dips, because from time to time all sorts of things would happen which would leave us apparently penniless, but somehow something happened. We were always pulled out at the last moment. So divine providence, or what you will, we were pulled out at the last moment. But by the time he was 6, I could see that the basis of development, the basis to allow his development to move forward, was flawed. There were holes in it. And I had to think to myself, why are these holes there? Can I do anything about it? And I was reading from a good friend, lent me a lot of medical textbooks, which I began to read. So I began to read more and more about the respiratory system, and I was more and more sure, from listening to Doran's breathing, particularly when he was attempting exercise or after exercise, that this was crucial. And if it was so crucial, because how could the brain function properly if it wasn't having the oxygen delivered to it in the kind of coordinated, balanced, responsive way that the beauty of normal development provided for? Someone lent us a TV and said, look, you've got to listen to this Horizon program. There's a guy called Professor Patrick Wall, who's head of cerebral studies at London University. They're talking about brain plasticity. I think you should listen. So they brought the telly and they put it in, and virtuously put on the program. And he was saying things that I had assumed, I theorized about, could be. I couldn't see how the human brain could be so lacking in its ability to reform itself after an injury. I really couldn't see why this was denied so strenuously. And to quote Shakespeare, methinks thou dost protest too much. It just seemed they were so anxious to tell me nothing could be done. So here was Patrick Wall telling me that environmental enrichment, that is putting brain injured rats in cages where they had enriched experiences, but these enriched experiences involved a lot of movement. And of course, a rat for whom one paw is dysfunctional, or through its vision is dysfunctional, as they wanted them to run around the mazes, they had to leave enough limbs to be able to facilitate this. So now what was interesting about this was, it was kind of accepted that exercise may have had something to do with it, but not accepted that breathing might have something to do with it underneath the exercise, because they'd never tested the rats' breathing. So if you're running a paper, you can't, it's an assumption to say, oh, it might have had something to do with the breathing. And nobody would know how to look at a rat's breathing at that time, or probably think that it was worthwhile. So I sent a copy of my book to Professor Wall, and I said what I more or less told you, that I thought it was something else, and I thought the circulatory system, if the respiratory circulatory system was affected, then other organs that could be contributing to brain growth and healing might also be compromised in all sorts of subtle and interesting ways, which I didn't know about, which I'd like to find out more. So he was lovely. He was an amazing man. And I found out afterwards, because he was so nice, he said in his obituary, they said he didn't suffer fools gladly. So I realized, so he obviously didn't think I was a fool. So he didn't put a desk between us. He pulled the chairs up so we were together. Behind us were his rats. I quite like rats because they're very good mothers and they're highly intelligent. So I had no problem with rats. Anyway, so he said to me, I really am interested in what you're saying. I think perhaps I can rephrase it a bit for you. How does that seem? And I was, well, yes, that does seem a lot better. You much closer to what I would like to have said had I had better terminology. So he said, well, I think you should do a PhD. There are a number of PhDs walking around my department who didn't have first degrees in science. Have you got a first degree? Well, I said, yes, but it was in art. He said, never mind, that will do. And he said, I think you should go into the psychology department because they will be a lot more flexible for you in what you want to study and how you want to study it. So I'm going to get you in as a qualifier. But this doesn't exist anymore. So if an eminent person in the university, and I was very innocent, I had no idea how eminent he was, he just seemed awfully warm, lovely to talk to. So he could put you forward if he could find someone to bat for you, and he found me Dr. Dorothy Einen, who was in the psychology department. You did 3 years in one, and then you could choose to go on and do a doctorate. So this was wonderful. I mean, there was no internet, you understand. So I now had the University Science Library up and down, with big lots of books, you know, up and down staircases, and occasionally managing to get a lift that wasn't dysfunctional, or a photocopier that wasn't dysfunctional. And then coming back on the train with all these goodies, looking at them and beginning to piece things together. So unfortunately, Professor Wall passed away. He went to the States and then he passed away. So I didn't have anyone else, except the department at that time was full of quite eccentric professors, some of whom obviously had neurological problems themselves and had come into psychology to find out why they were obviously so bright, but there were certain things they couldn't do. And so they were all interested in anybody else's new ideas. When I finally went back into the university after coming out, I went into the neurology department. They didn't want to know any of this. They didn't really want to know anything that was a recognized science in the psychology department was almost outlawed in the neurology department, which, apart from my two supervisors, but they were old in a sense. So they still belong slightly to a different era. And I was really, really grateful that I had been put in the psychology department, because what I was putting together, psychologists technically study behavior, but then they would want to know, well, when somebody behaves in this way, what's going on in the brain? And I was wanting to know, when you behave like this, what's going on in the body? What's going on with the respiratory system? And there was access to a lot of papers that were telling me that the diaphragm was a multifunctional organ. It was your main postural organ. It returned the deoxygenated blood from the veins back to the heart. It was connected to your lungs and your heart and all your internal organs, which move up and down when we breathe. It was the means of generating the movement of cerebral spinal fluid and lymph around the body, change respiratory rate and depth in relation to the body's metabolic oxygen needs, and compromised when necessary, and could also save your life by whipping blood back from your skeletal muscles if your heart was in danger. And also it took you down into sleep. So it moved you from what's called the sympathetic nervous system, which is your skeletal muscles, to the parasympathetic nervous system, which is your deep internal organs, right? So when you go down to sleep, you want to make that change. You think when you go to sleep, you're signing off, but you're not. The night shift is coming on, and the night shift would like everything to be appropriate for them when they get to it. But of course, if you have a big meal the night before and done a lot of unnecessary exercise and caused a lot of imbalances, then it's really, really difficult for them. So no wonder you don't feel so well the next day, because they're still trying to finish off their job. So now, most brain growth takes place when we're asleep, and particularly during what's called rapid eye movement sleep, which is dream sleep, which is, of course, when the dream is a reenactment of the nerve responses, muscular responses, emotional responses that were occurring during the day, and then they're connected to previous experiences to get and then a story is placed upon it to give it a coherence, which also has some interesting ramifications. But essentially, the poor brain. Oh, of course, what I found that I neglected to say, which is central to this, and I found this really early on, and then I began to become clearer and clearer as more and more studies occurred, was this. When there is a drop of oxygen to the fetal brain, then the oxygen delivered via the umbilical cord to the lungs and diaphragm is then redirected to the brain. Obviously not all of it, because you need to keep them for after your birth, but enough to weaken their development. So, of course, if you're premature, obviously you're going to have a problem with the development of your respiratory system. It can be that both situations arise at the same time. So now, 2 months into pregnancy, the baby is beginning to what's called fetal breathe. That is, the diaphragm, which is very flat, is moving, and it's stretching the lung cells, stretching. Of course, it's working on the lower organs of the body as well. It's nicely placed in the middle as a division and as a connection. So this is a trigger for switching on the genetic material in the lung cell. And as long ago as the early 1990s, this was what was being stated in many papers. So,
Linda, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt. So,
no, go on.
You're laying out the entire science of your breakthrough with working with children with neurological difficulties, and unfortunately we don't necessarily have
I'm going to stop there.
canvas of time.
No, I was just getting to that point to explain why that was the missing point. Really. Sorry.
So and this may not be clear. Linda wrote this book, was it 40 years ago? 40, 30?
Yes, let me see. 88.
So this is a reprint.
Published in 88.
It published in 88. This book was a cult classic among social workers in the UK.
Yes,
even though it's been out of print for years, they trade it back and forth. And when I heard that from Linda, I said, Linda, I know someone that will publish it. And that's what Skyhorse stepped up and published it. And for people that want to know about Linda's work, if they go to lindascotson.com, you can learn all about it. And you can actually see one of her current clients, a young boy named Hugo, his parents were told he'd never move, basically, wouldn't be able to sit by himself. And he is learning to crawl. And he's making tremendous, unexpected, unanticipated progress. So I think people got a sense of the depth of Linda's thinking on this, but I want to make sure they understand that she's also got 40 plus years of actually working with children like this, and making changes that are completely unexpected, unprecedented. And I don't know anyone else that does this. And I think she's got a tremendous amount of offer for anybody working with any child in difficulty. It doesn't even need to be something extreme, because, well, she gave the beginning of the explanation, and there's obviously a lot more to it. But if you go to lindascotson.com, yep.
Could I just say that I also work over Skype or Zoom, and
Yes.
I have a way of teaching parents at a distance because of the way when they become my hands, and there is a way in which I can do this, and it really works.
This is so, this is so important. Yeah, so this is not something you need to go off and study 4 years to be able to do. Linda can teach the parent and has successfully. We were working with somebody recently, you and I, Linda, our friend in North Carolina, and he's tried everything, done everything, and Linda was able to convey to he and his wife what they could do to help their child immediately and getting immediate results. Now, obviously, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of time. There's no way getting around that. But if you have a methodology and you understand the methodology and you can stick with it and stay positive, remarkable things happen, which you can see at lindascotson.com, because we have Hugo from the time he was just wriggling to the time that he's now actually crawling. And so much so that he has to be watched because now he can get away.
It's fascinating what I've listened to her is my son's now 26, but she's made some connections that just make absolutely sense to me for even my son. At a time he had ataxia and some breathing issues, I wish what we could do somehow. She's got so much information, and probably in some seminars, maybe a series of seminars, so people can absorb it. But it just makes so much sense where she's going. And this problem, one of the things I have a problem with the medical community is that they get tunnel vision, and they look at one way, and they don't allow other ideas and concepts to come in. And so they just keep going in this one direction. What I've got from listening from Linda is we need to welcome other opinions and other ideas on how we deal with the body naturally. Instead of just using chemicals and drugs all the time, let's go back to the basics of what these kids and how they interact with their mother, and then dealing with the body is built. It's a perfect machine. Sometimes we have a little problems with some kids, but if we can completely understand what the functions are of the entire body process, especially the gut and the brain together and the breathing, we can deal with so many kids. So, wow, this has been informative for me.
Oh, great.
Linda, thank you. This is, I know we spend a lot of time here, but it does make a lot of sense.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about breathing and autism, because it is absolutely central to the condition.
Well,
so maybe
you know what? I'm developing a concept of trying to come back with chronic illness onto my program, and I'd love to get in and get more detail with you later this fall, because we need to deal with chronic illness, not only with our kids, but as adults now too. And the medical community is blind to what could happen, and then the healing process. So I would like to have you on as a guest here again this fall and talk about it, because I think chronic illness is a big issue for our country.
True, and I treat a lot of adults. We use hyperbaric oxygen as well. So we have a lot of adults who turn up with a hyperbaric oxygen because they've heard about that. And when I look at their body structure, they're like this, and there's no space between the bottom of the rib cage and the pelvis. And when I talk to them about their lives, their birth was often a struggle. They were under a lot of stress during their lives. I have a lot of cancer patients who clearly have had one stress after another. And where cancer lies is where the capillary networks are not so functional. So, and you can relate that to the way in which we breathe. There are many compensatory routes to breathing with a weak diaphragm, which although they will keep you going, you're laying down problems in the future. So I teach them as well. And that's very lovely to see how their bodies change and how their attitude to life changes. So as you say, it's a whole spectrum of different problems. If clinicians looked at breathing first of all, and you can do it, there's apparatus that you can use so you can see straight away, that would be the beginning of a new paradigm in health.
Wonderful. Okay, a lot of information today. I've learned some things here. This is amazing. It really is. And we've been talking today with Linda Scotson and her book, The Other Child.
I've got it here.
There it is right there, Ken. Thank you. And I got my copy, so I'm breaking it down. Ken knows how I read books. I don't read it front cover to back cover. I have to go dig around and hunt around, and that's just the way I am with reading books, but I'm going to get there. So folks, you've been watching and listening to the Right on Point podcast. It's a candid discussion of your civil liberties issues and our legal rights with our government, but we also talk about, and we're going to start talking in more detail, the explosion of chronic illness, the medical community and their unwillingness to accept optional or alternative treatments, and the constant pressures on the family unit for dealing with chronic illness. I want to thank my guests today, Linda Scotson, and also Ken McCarthy. Thank you very much for being here as my co-pilot. Thank you, the many listeners and viewers of this program. And I leave you with the following each week, and that is keep learning, keep challenging yourself, and always, always question authority. Have a good day, everyone.